stop begins the way many authority encounters do, with something small enough to feel forgettable, yet consequential enough to invite scrutiny. A vehicle is stopped for an improper lane change-on infraction that, by itself, carries little narrative weight. What gives it gravity is not the traffic violation, but what unfolds around it. Within minutes, the scene becomes less about a car and more about control: who has it, who believes they have it, and how quickly that balance can fracture. From the outset, the atmosphere is unstable. The subject is visibly agitated, speaking rapidly, attempting to narrate her own innocence before any formal accusation is made. This preemptive defense is not uncommon. It often appears when individuals feel vulnerable to authority and attempt to reclaim agency through explanation. But in law enforcement encounters, explanation does not equal compliance, and compliance, especially perceived compliance, frequently dictates the direction of the stop. An early and critical detail is easy to overlook. The officer engaging her initially clarifies that he did not initiate the stop. This should have diffused tension. Instead, it exposes confusion. The subject does not distinguish between officers or roles. To her, the uniform is singular and authority is collective. The lack of clarity fuels her anxiety, which in turn begins to shape the officer's perceptions of her behavior. This is the first pivot point. Lawful stops require structure. When structure erodes, officers often rely on behavioral cues to reassert control. Rapid speech, emotional volatility, and nonlinear responses are interpreted through a familiar lens: impairment, instability, or both. Whether those interpretations are accurate matters less in the moment than the fact that they feel actionable. The command to remain in the vehicle becomes a test. The subject resists not aggressively, but verbally and emotionally. She insists she has done nothing wrong, emphasizes her desire to go home, and reacts strongly to perceived disrespect. None of these actions constitute a crime, but they do challenge the hierarchy of the stop. In that challenge, authority feels threatened, and threatened authority seeks justification to escalate. At this stage, the officer's language shifts subtly. What began as traffic enforcement becomes behavioral assessment. Questions broaden. The subject is asked about her origins, her destination, her mental health, her medical history. Each question serves a dual purpose: information gathering and behavioral probing. The more she speaks, the more material exists to frame her as erratic. Crucially, the subject is not the driver. This fact sits at the center of the encounter like a loaded hinge. She repeatedly asserts it, believing it shields her from further scrutiny. Legally, it should limit the scope of certain investigations, particularly those related to driving impairment. But procedurally, it does not remove her from the officer's control over the scene. The request for her to exit the vehicle marks another escalation. Exiting a vehicle is a lawful order in many jurisdictions during a traffic stop, but context matters. Here, the request is no longer tethered solely to officer safety. It is framed as necessary for further assessment. Her refusal is immediate and emphatic. She does not couch it in legal language or calm explanation. Instead, it is rooted in distrust. Distrust is contagious. Once expressed, it changes the encounter's trajectory. Officers interpret refusal not merely as non-compliance, but as obstruction. The subject, meanwhile, interprets repeated requests as harassment. Both sides dig in, and the middle ground disappears. What follows is a critical psychological shift. The officers begin to articulate concern about impairment. This concern is not yet grounded in objective indicators tied to driving. No discussion of lane positioning beyond the initial infraction, no mention of odor, no standardized observations. Instead, it is grounded in demeanor. The subject's volatility becomes the justification. Here, the boundaries of reasonable suspicion blur. Field sobriety tests are designed for drivers. The subject challenges the premise, insisting she was not operating the vehicle. She is correct in a narrow sense. But the officers proceed as though her presence and behavior alone are sufficient to warrant evaluation. This is not an uncommon misalignment. It is where legal theory meets practical enforcement and, often, where rights begin to erode. The request to examine her eyes is particularly telling. It is framed as routine, benign, even helpful. But routine actions require lawful grounding. The subject initially agrees in principle, then retracts consent when asked to exit the vehicle. Consent, once withdrawn, cannot be compelled without legal basis. This is another hinge moment. Instead of de-escalation, the interaction tightens. Her refusal is interpreted as defiance. The officer's tone hardens. The encounter becomes less about assessing safety and more about enforcing compliance. Each refusal narrows her options, even though the underlying justification remains shaky. When the officers explain that her non-participation places them in a difficult position, they are not wrong, but the difficulty is largely self-created. The system often equates cooperation with innocence, resistance with guilt. This is a dangerous equation, particularly for individuals who do not communicate calmly under stress. The subject's insistence that she is not the driver resurfaces repeatedly. It is her anchor. But the officers have already moved beyond that distinction. In their framing, her behavior alone has become the offense. This is how encounters drift from specific enforcement into generalized control. The moment handcuffs are applied, the power dynamic finalizes. The subject expresses confusion and disbelief. She asks why she is under arrest. The answer, when it comes, is procedural rather than explanatory. Arrest becomes the tool used to resolve ambiguity. Instead of clarifying whether a crime has occurred, the system defaults to containment. This is the opening hook for a reason. In the span of seconds, the encounter crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. The subject's earlier refusals, emotional volatility, and distrust are retroactively framed as justification for arrest. The distinction between passenger and driver collapses entirely. Once restrained, the subject's behavior escalates further. This escalation is predictable. Restraint without understanding often produces panic. Panic produces resistance. Resistance produces additional charges. The cycle completes itself. What is often missed in these moments is causality. The system will later describe her actions in isolation: resisting, battery, impairment. But those actions did not emerge in a vacuum. They were shaped, step by step, by an encounter that prioritized control over clarity. By the time formal procedures are red warnings, requests for testing the outcome is already decided. These steps are no longer investigative, they are confirmatory. The subject's refusal to submit to testing is recorded not as a continuation of her earlier assertion of rights, but as further evidence of guilt. Her emotional responses are catalogued as instability rather than distress. In hindsight, the charges appear inevitable. But inevitability is often manufactured. Each decision, each request, framed as optional but treated as mandatory. Each refusal interpreted as defiance narrows the path until only escalation remains. This is not a story about a single bad decision. It is a study in compounding authority. How minor non-compliance becomes suspicion. How suspicion becomes justification. How justification becomes arrest. And how arrest, once made, retroactively legitimizes every step that led there. The tragedy is not just the outcome, but the predictability of it. This encounter followed a familiar script, one written not by any individual officer, but by institutional habits that reward control and penalize deviation. The subject never stood a real chance once the frame shifted from traffic enforcement to behavioral management. In the next phase, we will examine how the system formalizes this escalation, how charges are layered, how narratives are constructed, and how accountability dissipates once the machinery is in motion. Once the handcuffs are applied, the encounter enters a new phase, one governed less by investigation and more by procedure. At this point, the system's momentum takes over. What matters now is not whether the initial assumptions were correct, but whether subsequent steps align with protocol strongly enough to withstand later scrutiny. This is where many bodycam cases quietly solidify, not through clear evidence, but through administrative inevitability. The subject's immediate reaction to being restrained is disbelief. She repeats a single assertion with increasing urgency: she was not driving. This distinction, so central to her understanding of the situation, has already lost relevance in the officer's framework. From their perspective, the decision to detain has transformed the encounter. The question is no longer whether she was driving, but whether her behavior during the stop justifies the actions taken against her. This shift is subtle but critical. Once detention occurs, earlier ambiguities are reinterpreted through a new lens. Her agitation becomes resistance. Her confusion becomes non-compliance. Her emotional distress becomes instability. The narrative tightens around her, and the scope for reconsideration narrows. When officers physically control a subject, they often rely on the language of safety to justify continued force. Commands become sharper. Tolerance for verbal protest evaporates. Any physical movement, intentional or reflexive, is viewed as escalation. The subject's repeated pleas are not met with clarification, but with restraint. This is not necessarily cruelty, it is institutional reflex. The allegation of biting is introduced in this phase. It is significant not only because of its seriousness, but because of its timing. Such allegations frequently arise during moments of close physical struggle, where perceptions are heightened and documentation is fragmented. Whether intentional or not, the claim dramatically reframes the encounter. What began as a traffic stop now includes an accusation of violence against an officer. This is how charges multiply. Battery on a law enforcement officer carries weight far beyond resisting arrest. It introduces moral gravity to the officer's actions and justifies any force used thereafter. Importantly, once such an allegation is made, it becomes extremely difficult to contest. The system tends to privilege officer accounts, especially when bodycam footage is chaotic or obstructed. The subject's continued verbal protests insisting she is not a criminal, that she has done nothing wrong, are emotionally raw but procedurally meaningless at this stage. The officers move forward with formalities. Identification is asserted. Rights are implied rather than explained. The encounter is now being prepared for documentation, not resolution. The request for a breath test is particularly revealing. It is delivered in a standardized cadence, reciting consequences rather than context. The language assumes the subject is a driver subject to implied consent laws. This assumption is never reconciled with the earlier insistence that she was not operating the vehicle. Instead, the system treats her as though the distinction no longer matters. This is where legal thresholds quietly bend. Implied consent statutes are predicated on driving or operating a motor vehicle. Applying them to a passenger requires a legal justification that is not clearly articulated here. But once the request is made and refused, the refusal itself becomes evidence admissible, consequential, and difficult to unwind later. Her refusal is emotional, hostile, and unequivocal. In the administrative record, however, tone does not matter. A refusal is a refusal. The system records it as such, stripping away the surrounding confusion. This is how complex encounters are flattened into checkboxes. At this stage, the officer's demeanor shifts again. The tension drains from their voices. Decisions have been made. The outcome is locked in. What remains is transport, processing, and paperwork. For the subject, however, the experience is far from over. Emotional shock gives way to desperation. She repeats her innocence not as argument, but as plea. The bodycam captures a familiar refrain. "I am not a criminal." This statement is less about legal status and more about identity. The subject is attempting to resist the role being imposed upon her. But roles in this system are not self-assigned. They are conferred through procedure. Once labeled, reversal is rare. The officers discuss her condition among themselves. Their language suggests substance influence without specificity. Phrases like "on some kind of something" reflect uncertainty, yet that uncertainty does not slow the process. Instead, it becomes justification for caution, which in turn justifies continued restraint. This is one of the most troubling aspects of such encounters. Ambiguity does not protect the citizen, it empowers the system. When officers are unsure, they default to control. When control is established, uncertainty is no longer a barrier, it becomes a feature. The charges are later listed plainly: battery, resisting arrest without violence, and driving under the influence. Presented together, they create a coherent narrative of culpability. Separated, they raise questions. How does one commit DUI without driving? How does resisting arrest occur absent a lawful basis for arrest? How does battery arise in the absence of clear intent? These questions are rarely explored in real time. They are deferred to courts, where the burden shifts dramatically. The subject, now a defendant, must challenge not just facts, but credibility, interpretation, and institutional trust. The odds are not balanced. The bodycam footage, often perceived as an objective witness, is limited. It captures fragments, raised voices, partial movements, obstructed views. It does not capture internal states or legal nuance. In ambiguous moments, it tends to favor the authority wearing it. This is not because of malice, but because of framing. As the scene concludes, the emotional weight remains with the subject. She continues to assert her lack of criminal history, her confusion, her distress. These assertions will not appear prominently in charging documents. What will appear are the labels: intoxicated, resistant, combative. This is how encounters are transformed. The initial reason for the stop, a minor traffic violation, disappears entirely from relevance. What remains is a cascade of offenses generated during the interaction itself. The system punishes not the original behavior, but the reaction to enforcement. In examining this phase, it becomes clear that escalation was not inevitable, but it was facilitated. Each procedural step narrowed the path forward. Opportunities for de-escalation, clear explanation, acknowledgement of her passenger status, temporary disengagement were bypassed in favor of control. This does not require malicious intent. It requires only adherence to habit. Law enforcement training often emphasizes command presence and compliance. When those are challenged, even verbally, officers are conditioned to respond with authority rather than curiosity. The result is encounters that escalate not because of danger, but because of rigidity. By the time the subject is charged and removed from the scene, the narrative is complete. It will not include the confusion that defined the early moments, nor the legal ambiguity surrounding the sobriety request. It will present a clean arc from erratic behavior to justified arrest. But bodycam footage, when examined carefully, tells a messier story. One where power dynamics shift incrementally, where legal thresholds blur under stress, and where the system's need for resolution overrides the individual's need for understanding. In the final part, we will step back and examine the broader implications of this encounter, how such cases persist, how accountability is diluted, and how institutional structures allow small decisions to produce life-altering consequences. By the time the encounter reaches its administrative conclusion, the narrative has hardened. What began as a traffic stop has been converted into a criminal case, and that conversion carries consequences far beyond the roadside. The system now speaks in the language of charges, reports, and dispositions. Nuance fades. Context collapses. What remains is a simplified account that presents escalation as logical, force as necessary, and outcome as unavoidable. This is the final transformation where lived experience becomes institutional record. The subject's conviction on all charges is often cited as proof that the system worked as intended. But convictions do not retroactively validate the path taken to reach them. They reflect the system's internal coherence, not necessarily its fairness. To understand how this outcome was produced, it is necessary to examine not just individual actions, but the structure that shaped them. Throughout the encounter, authority operated on assumption rather than clarification. Each assumption was small enough to appear reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a chain that pulled the encounter toward arrest. The assumption that agitation indicates impairment. The assumption that refusal indicates guilt. The assumption that control must be maintained at all costs. None of these are codified laws, yet they function as operational rules. This is how institutional momentum works. Once an officer begins to perceive a subject as a problem to be managed, rather than a citizen to be assisted, every subsequent interaction is filtered through that perception. Commands replace explanations. Compliance replaces consent. Resistance, real or perceived, becomes the justification for force. In this case, the subject's communication style played a decisive role. She spoke quickly, emotionally, and without deference. She challenged authority not through legal argument, but through distrust and personal assertion. The system is poorly equipped to handle this kind of engagement. It is built to respond to calm compliance or overt threat. Anything in between is treated as instability. This raises a critical question about accountability. Should citizens be required to perform emotional regulation under stress to preserve their rights? In practice, the answer appears to be yes. Those who fail to do so often find themselves escalated against, not because they are dangerous, but because they are inconvenient. The passenger versus driver distinction exemplifies this problem. Legally, it should have constrained the scope of the investigation. Practically, it was treated as irrelevant once behavioral suspicion took precedence. The system did not pause to reconcile this contradiction. Instead, It proceeded as though authority itself resolved the issue. This is not an anomaly. Across jurisdictions, bodycam footage reveals a pattern where legal thresholds are treated as flexible when behavior is deemed problematic. Reasonable suspicion expands. Probable cause is inferred. Arrest becomes a tool for sorting ambiguity rather than responding to crime. Once arrest occurs, the burden shifts entirely. The subject must now defend against charges that were generated during the arrest itself. Resisting arrest charges hinge on the lawfulness of the arrest, a question rarely resolved in the subject's favor. Battery charges arising from physical struggle often rest on officer testimony, which courts are inclined to credit. DUI charges, even when contested, benefit from implied consent frameworks that punish refusal more readily than impairment. The system does not require certainty. It requires plausibility. Bodycam footage, while invaluable, does not inherently correct these imbalances. It records what happens, but not why decisions are made. It captures reactions, not intentions. When footage is chaotic, courts often defer to officer interpretation. The camera becomes a witness that speaks in fragments, easily shaped by narrative framing. In reviewing this encounter, it is tempting to focus on the subject's behavior, her language, her refusals, her emotional volatility. But doing so risks missing the larger point. The system is designed to absorb such behavior and respond proportionally. When it fails to do so, the failure is structural, not personal. Though escalation was possible at multiple points, clear explanation of her status as a passenger, acknowledgement of her fear, temporary disengagement to allow emotions to settle. None of these require abandoning officer safety. They require flexibility, something institutions often struggle to provide. Instead, the encounter followed a familiar script. Non-compliance triggered escalation. Escalation triggered resistance. Resistance justified force. Force generated charges. Charges validated escalation. The loop closed neatly, leaving little room for alternative interpretation. This is how accountability dissipates. No single decision appears egregious. No individual action clearly violates policy. Responsibility is distributed so widely that it becomes untraceable. The outcome feels tragic, yet inevitable. For the subject, the consequences extend beyond conviction. Criminal records carry long shadows: employment barriers, social stigma, psychological trauma. These outcomes are rarely considered in the moment of enforcement. The system is focused on resolution, not aftermath. For law enforcement, encounters like this reinforce existing practices. Convictions are interpreted as affirmation. Training remains unchanged. Patterns repeat. The absence of consequence becomes a form of instruction. The broader implication is unsettling. If minor encounters can escalate this dramatically without clear criminal behavior, then the margin for error is wide. Citizens who do not conform to expected behavioral norms are at greater risk, not because they are dangerous, but because they disrupt procedural flow. This case does not require villains to be instructive. It requires examination. It shows how authority, when left unchecked by reflection, defaults to force. It shows how systems prioritize order over understanding. And it shows how easily the line between enforcement and overreach can blur. The purpose of revisiting such encounters is not to assign outrage, but to recognize patterns, to understand how small decisions accumulate, to see how rights can erode not through dramatic violations, but through ordinary procedure. In the end, the bodycam does what it always does. It records. It does not judge. That task falls to those willing to look beyond outcomes and ask how they were produced, not with hindsight bias, but with structural awareness. This encounter will not change policy on its own. Most do not. But collectively, they form a record, a ledger of moments where authority was tested and often failed to recalibrate. Whether that record leads to reform depends on whether institutions are willing to confront the gap between legality and justice. The story ends not with resolution, but with a question left unanswered by the system itself. How many such encounters are required before escalation is no longer seen as normal, and restraint becomes the measure of authority?